Good morning, church. Let's begin our day once again with Jesus, and as we live moment by moment, day by day, with Him on our minds, I pray that we would fall in love with Him and just see how good God truly is. With that, let's begin. I have another saying for you this morning, and you might be familiar with this one as well, or at least the ideal of it. But it goes like this. Have you heard of the saying, in one ear and out the other? Basically, this is an expression that we use when somebody doesn't pay attention or doesn't listen, and then they just forget it, right? So it's this, the words go in one ear and then just comes back out the other. So it doesn't even process or register in their heads. Sometimes we use this expression to describe someone that's forgetful, right? They get told one thing and then literally the next moment, they forget about it. It just escapes them completely, and then they don't do what they were told to do. It's this ideal of hearing it but not heeding it. It's this hearing it but there's no effect, there's no response. Now, have you guys ever had a moment like this before where you were told something but then you just kind of didn't do it, or just went over your head, or went in one ear and out the other? I've had many of these moments myself, right? My parents have told me things to do and gave me life advice on what to do in certain situations, and then literally it's just whatever they say is blah 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 blah, not in a disrespectful way. It's just goes in one ear and then out the other, and it just means nothing. I don't do anything about it, and I make the mistake or whatever it may be. I remember one time when I was in Tennessee during my mission trip, we were driving a bunch of students from Tennessee to Georgia. We were on this choir trip, and I remember telling the students that we were going to stop by a gas station so that they could go to the bathroom if they needed to. It was a long trip, and we didn't want to take too many stops, and I remember telling them very distinctly, and when we got there, no one had to go, and so I went to the restroom, came back, and then we took off. And literally 30 minutes later, a bunch of the kids started to say that, "Oh, Mr. Tim, can we stop by and go to the bathroom, please?" And literally, I was thinking, man, do things just go in one ear and out the other? Did you not hear what I was saying? Okay. Now, maybe you've had an experience like this, but did you know that there's a difference between hearing and listening? I love these kind of questions, right? Think about it. What's the difference between hearing and listening? You see, hearing, we can define hearing as the perception of sound, right? While listening is the active understanding of the sound that you hear. Okay? So just because you're hearing doesn't necessarily mean you're listening. If we just hear, basically that's when we fall into this expression of in one ear and out the other, because all you're doing is just taking in the sound, and that's it. Now, I think it's really important that we learn both how to hear and how to listen. And in today's reading in our devotion, we find and learn that the church of Thessalonica learns to do both, to hear and to listen. Now, just to quickly remind you of what's going on and what we've already talked about. Remember, Paul is writing this letter to his first church group after having to leave the city of Thessalonica because of persecution, right? And now that he's away from the city, he's really worried about them because he's only spent a few weeks with this group of new believers. And he's super thankful. And as we talked about yesterday, do you remember? He's thankful because he found out that they're actually doing really good. Right? They're talking the walk and walking the talk, right? They're living it out, sharing the gospel with people around them in different regions. And because of their actions, they're spreading the gospel message, and people are hearing and seeing it. And Paul is super thankful for that, right? Now, 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2, we find another section in Paul's letter that continues talking about how thankful he is to the church. He kind of has two different thank you letters in one book. And this time, he recalls the time that he spent with them. And we find this little part here in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2, verse 13. This is what it says. And we also thank God continually because when you received the word of God, when you heard from us, you accepted it not as human word, but as it actually is, the word of God, which is indeed at work in you who believe. Now, when you first read this, like I did, I was a little confused. The way that Paul kind of words this is very grammatically odd. But to give you a quick translation of what he's saying, basically, Paul says that he's thankful to this church because they have received and accepted the word of God. Now, these two words are really important and give us the lesson for today. You see, when you look at the Greek word for receive, when Paul uses this in this context, he's implying that they heard with their own ears about the word of God, the gospel message. They heard it from Paul. Then get this, the word accept that Paul uses here in the Greek, in this context, implies that they welcomed the word of God. Or in other words, when they heard it, they listened and they welcomed it in. Now, Paul uses interesting order. He says that they accepted not as human word, and he compares that to the word of God, right? It's not human word, but word of God. Basically, Paul is saying that this church, when they heard the word of God, they also listened and they took it seriously, right? They didn't let it go in one ear and out the other. Instead, they welcomed it into their hearts and made it theirs. But how does Paul know this is true? How does he know that this is really what happened? How does he know that it's not just going in one ear and out the other? You see, and that's where the last part comes into play. The last part says that the word of God, which is indeed at work in you who believe, in other words, the word of God is living in them. And as we talked about yesterday, these people lived out the gospel message in all parts of their lives. And that's how Paul knows, because despite the suffering they were facing, the persecution, and all the attacks that they received, they continued to stay strong and close to God. They received the word and welcomed it into their hearts. So church, are we just hearers of the word of God? Or are we also listeners? I want to challenge you not to be just hearing the word of God, but let's welcome it into our lives. So remember this. Let's not only be hearers of the word of God, let us welcome it into every part of our lives.